They thought he was broken. A retired canine dog named Storm, once hailed as a national hero, was now pacing in circles, tail rigid eyes locked onto an empty stretch of drywall in the corner of an old nursing home. Then came the barking, sharp, relentless echoing through the quiet halls like a fire alarm in the dead of night. At first, everyone laughed it off. Must be a rat in the wall, someone joked. Maybe he smells mold, another added. But then Storm did it again. And again, always at the same wall, always at the same hour. In the look in his eyes, that wasn't fear. That was a warning. Storm wasn't supposed to be here for detection work. After serving 5 years with the Marion County Sheriff's K-9 unit, he was honorably retired after a spinal injury nearly ended his life. He was now part of a state program placing retired working dogs in nursing homes as emotional support companions. He had been at Maple Oaks Care Center for less than 72 hours when the barking started. Officer Mike Daniels, Storm's former handler and now his full-time caretaker, was used to his old partner's quirks. Twitchy paws during thunderstorms, pacing when he heard sirens. But this was different. "Storm, leave it," Mike said, tugging gently on the leash. Storm didn't budge. He just growled, low eyes fixed on the blank white wall across from room 214. "Come on, buddy, it's nothing. Just drywall." But Storm pulled forward again, then began scratching at the baseboard nose pressed against the plaster, like he could smell something no one else could. The wall frankly looked like any other. Off-white, cracked in one corner, a little water damage near the ceiling. There was a mop closet nearby, and an old grandfather clock that hadn't worked in years. But something about the way Storm reacted, ears pinned back, body stiff, gaze locked, sent a chill down Mike's spine. Later that evening, over bad coffee in the staff lounge, Mike casually brought it up to Sandra, the night nurse. "You ever notice anything weird around room 214? Sandra, a woman in her late 60s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, shrugged. "Weird like what?" "Storm keeps barking at the wall across from it." She blinked. "That wall?" "Yeah." A pause. "Then that whole wing used to be bigger, you know, before the renovation." Mike leaned in. "How much bigger?" "Hard to say. Maybe 1 or 2 extra rooms. They walled it off years ago. Said it wasn't up to code." "Who said that?" "Old management. Place changed hands 3 times in the past decade. Nobody keeps track of what's original and what's not." She sipped her tea. "Why you think your dog smells asbestos or something?" "I think he smells something alive." The next day, Mike walked Storm past the wall again, leash in hand. Same reaction. Barking, digging, whining. But this time something else happened. An old resident named Mr. Harper, who usually kept to himself, shuffled out of his room and watched silently. "You all right, Mr. Harper?" Mike asked. The old man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at the wall, then at Storm, then back at the wall. Finally, he said, "That dog sees what y'all refuse to see." Mike frowned. "What do you mean?" Mr. Harper's voice dropped to a whisper. "She's still in there." "Who?" The man gave no answer, just shuffled away, muttering something under his breath about ghosts and secrets, and they never let her out. That night, Mike couldn't sleep. He opened his laptop and tried to search for any history about Maple Oaks. No lawsuits, no missing person reports, no complaints on public record. But the place had changed owners frequently, and there were suspicious gaps in the online archives whole years, with no inspection logs or renovation permits. He leaned back in his chair. "What are you trying to tell me, Storm?" The dog curled on his blanket nearby didn't move. By the 3rd day, staff started complaining. Storm's barking was too loud. Residents were getting agitated. The administrator, Ms. Lovett, pulled Mike aside. "Officer Daniels, I understand you're very fond of your dog, but we can't have this kind of disruption. If he keeps this up, I'm afraid we'll have to remove him from the building." Mike tried to reason with her. "What if he's trying to tell us something?" Ms. Lovett's face darkened. "It's just a wall, officer. Let's not go chasing ghosts. Sometimes ghosts are just unsolved crimes." That didn't go over well. "Hey, if you believe dogs, like Storm, deserve more than just medals and that their instincts can save lives, make sure to subscribe to our channel, Heroes for Animals. We tell the stories that others ignore." That evening, Mike waited until the halls were empty. He didn't want to get fired or fined, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that Storm was right. He returned to the wall Storm beside him and pressed his ear against it. Nothing. But when he knocked lightly, 3 taps, Storm growled. Mike pulled out a flashlight, crouched down, and examined the floorboard carefully. Then he saw it. A thin hairline crack, almost imperceptible, running vertically along the drywall. A poor patch job. "Somebody sealed something back here," he murmured. He pulled out his multi-tool and began to scrape gently at the wall. Storm stood perfectly still, tail low, body tense. The tip of the tool scraped something metal. Mike froze. Then came a sound so faint, he almost thought he imagined it. A thump from the other side of the wall. Not a pipe, not a rat, a human hand, knocking back. Mike stumbled back, heart pounding. Storm growled again, louder this time. Somewhere down the hallway, a resident's call light pinged. Mike didn't move. He stood frozen, staring at the wall. There was someone in there. Alive. He dialed 911. As the phone rang, he looked down at Storm and whispered, "You were right." Storm just stared at the wall, silent now. Watching, waiting. Because whatever was behind that wall wasn't done waiting yet. The 911 dispatcher didn't believe him at first. "You said you heard someone knock from inside the wall." Mike gripped his phone, staring at the drywall as Storm stood beside him, tail stiff, still watching. "That's right," Mike said. "It wasn't a pipe. It wasn't settling wood. It was a knock. 3 taps. Deliberate." The dispatcher hesitated. "Are you in immediate danger?" "No," he said. "But someone else might be." Emergency services arrived 11 minutes later. Mike met them outside, not wanting to raise alarm among the residents. The place was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that only deepened the unease. Firefighters brought thermal scanners and ground-penetrating radar. One of them, a young guy named Cruz, studied the readings and raised an eyebrow. "There's an insulated gap behind that wall," Cruz said. 2 feet wide, maybe 10 feet across. Could be a sealed utility room. "No," Mike said. "There's something moving in there." Cruz didn't argue. He just nodded to his team and started prepping the tools. Inside, Storm sat in front of the wall, ears perked up, eyes sharp. He hadn't barked since the night before. It was like he was waiting for permission or a reunion. The first strike of the sledgehammer echoed through the hallway like a shotgun blast. Plaster cracked, dust floated. A resident in the distance rang their call bell, likely disturbed by the noise. But Mike couldn't tear his eyes away. It took 4 hits. On the 5th, the wall split. A chunk of drywall fell inward, revealing a small dark cavity lined with rotting insulation and something else, an old wooden panel, like a false door. The firefighter stepped back. "You smell that?" Mike did. A mix of mold, old metal, and something worse, like the inside of a forgotten attic after a storm. They pried the wooden panel loose, and then there she was. She was curled on the floor, her back hunched, skin pale and bruised from time and isolation. Her hair was gray and wild, her eyes wide and darting under the flickering flashlight beam. She looked feral, starved, terrified, and alive. "Ma'am," one of the EMTs called, gently crouching. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes flinched toward him, but she didn't speak. Storm, without waiting for a command, walked forward slowly, ears lowered, and stopped just short of the threshold. Then he lay down. The woman looked at him, and for the first time her expression changed. Her lips trembled, her eyes welled, and she whispered something so soft Mike almost didn't hear it. "You came back." The EMTs moved quickly after that, getting her onto a stretcher, checking vitals, asking questions. She couldn't answer most of them. No medical bracelet. Just a faded cloth dress and a 6-digit number stitched into the sleeve, number 30927. "Who the hell is she?" Cruz muttered. Mike didn't say anything. His mind was racing. How long had she been in there? Days, weeks, or years? She was skeletal. Her wrists had ligature marks, old ones. She had pressure sores and sunken eyes. But somehow she had survived. At the hospital, doctors worked to stabilize her while police began investigating. Mike stayed behind at Maple. Maple Oak is sitting alone in the break room with a lukewarm cup of vending machine coffee, and Storm curled at his feet. He thought back to the night nurse's comment. That wing used to be bigger. He opened his phone and pulled up the old blueprints again. Sure enough, there it was, a room labeled Room 309, listed on plans from 1994. But on newer maps, it was gone, erased, as if she had been erased with it. The next morning, detectives arrived. The media hadn't picked up the story yet, but it was only a matter of time. The administrator, Ms. Lovett, looked pale as she spoke with them in her office. "I've only been here 3 years," she said. "We didn't even know that room existed. It wasn't on any of our documents." One detective, a tall guy with a Boston accent, asked, "In your maintenance logs?" Lovett swallowed. "Incomplete. We inherited a mess when we bought this place." Mike knew she was scared, but fear wasn't guilt. Someone else knew about that room. He returned to speak with Mr. Harper, the old man who'd mentioned she's still in there. This time Harper was waiting for him. "She have gray hair?" Harper asked, real thin. Didn't talk much. Mike nodded. Harper looked away, his eyes misting. She's still alive after all this time. You knew her. Not her name. None of us did. Just called her the quiet lady. She was here when I moved in back in '06. Used to sit in the garden sometimes. Never talked. And then she just disappeared one day. Folks asked about her. Staff said she moved facilities, but I knew. I knew that wasn't true. Mike frowned. Why didn't you say something? Harper looked at him raw and tired. Who would believe me? I've got Parkinson's. Sometimes I forget my grandkids' names. They'd say I imagined her. Mike didn't respond because he might have said the same thing until Storm started barking at a wall no one else noticed. That night, Mike sat with Storm by the window of their small apartment above the fire station. I don't know what they did to her, he said quietly, but someone put her in that wall and expected her to never come out. Storm nuzzled his leg and rested his head on Mike's foot. Whatever comes next, Mike whispered, we see it through. 2 days later, a break came. The 6-digit number on her sleeve. It matched an internal patient catalog from a defunct private healthcare firm, Pharmaco West. The firm had been subcontracted in the early 2000s to run experimental elder care studies under the radar funded by private investors. Most of their files had been sealed after a civil suit in 2008. But one thing stood out. Patient 3927, Grace L. status unstable response, reassigned to off-site observation. There was no forwarding address, but a surviving administrator listed in the lawsuit, Edward Kinney. And guess who had served as the director of operations at Maple Oaks in 2009? That's right, Edward Kinney. The hospital released a statement saying that the woman, presumed to be in her 80s, remains in critical condition, but is expected to survive. They didn't release her name because she still hadn't spoken more than 5 words. She refused to answer any questions, except when Storm visited. Mike brought him once out of instinct. He thought maybe it would comfort her. And it did. When Storm entered the room, Grace L. turned her head for the first time all day. Her expression changed, her lips parted, and she whispered, he found me. Then she fell asleep, clutching the side of Storm's harness like a lifeline. Back at Maple Oaks, room 309 had been torn apart. The police sealed the area as a crime scene. Investigators were combing through years of forgotten files and ignored inspections. Mike stood in front of the torn drywall with Storm at his side. I don't know how you knew, he said, but you knew. Storm sat quietly, his gaze fixed on the empty wall. Then slowly he turned and walked away as if to say, there's more to find. And Mike believed him. Because in a place like Maple Oaks, walls didn't just hide mold and wiring. They hid secrets. The woman in the wall had a face now. A nurse at St. Anthony's Hospital was checking vitals when the elderly patient previously listed as Jane Doe suddenly muttered something under her breath. Not a random sound, not gibberish, a word. Or maybe a name. Grace, she whispered. The nurse stopped. Grace, is that your name? The woman blinked slowly, her hands trembled, but her lips curled just slightly as if she'd pulled something out from the depths of a fog that had swallowed her for years. Later, when Mike visited with Storm, the nurse told him, she said her name's Grace. Mike nodded. It fits. But still, there was no last name, no social security number, no relatives listed in any national registry. Nothing. It was like she'd been erased on purpose. That night, Mike sat in his truck outside the hospital with Storm asleep in the passenger seat. He flipped through his old notebook, scribbling possible leads, timelines, names. Grace, Pharmaco West, Edward Kinney. None of it added up yet, but something inside him told him they were all connected. He picked up his phone and called a friend, Detective Ronnie Taylor from the old Missing Persons Division in Eugene. You remember Pharmaco West, Mike asked. Ronnie exhaled. Yeah, that was a mess. Clinical trials in nursing homes, under-the-table deals with assisted living facilities. Most of it was buried under sealed settlements. You ever hear the name Grace L. tied to that mess? A pause. Can't say I have, Ronnie said. But now you've got me curious. At Maple Oaks, the atmosphere had shifted. Room 309, now fully revealed, was sealed off with police tape. Investigators came and went, snapping photos, scanning for fingerprints, and lifting decades-old floorboards. Residents whispered. Staff avoided eye contact, and the administrator, Ms. Lovett, looked like she hadn't slept in days. Mike sat with her briefly in the cafeteria, trying to make sense of the bigger picture. You've run this place 3 years, right? She nodded. Since 2022. And before that, 2 short-term managers. I never met them. Honestly, I took the job because I thought it'd be quiet, peaceful. Did you ever come across the name Kinney? Her fork paused midair. Kinney, as in Edward Kinney. Yeah, I've seen it. Once or twice, on old invoices, the man who hired the original maintenance crew. But that's all I know. Why? Mike didn't answer right away, because in his gut, he knew this went deeper than a single woman trapped behind a wall. This was about what had been done to her and why nobody ever came looking. The next morning, Detective Taylor called back. I dug through some sealed records, he said. Off the books. There's a Grace Louise Abbott, born 1943, no death certificate. Last known address, a care home near Salem, also managed by Pharmaco West. Mike's pulse quickened. How'd she end up here? That's the thing, she didn't. There's no transfer paperwork. No admission logs. She just vanished from the system in 2006. That was the year Mr. Harper said the quiet lady disappeared. Taylor added, there's a theory that some of these memory loss studies were more like containment programs. They isolated high-risk patients, those with early onset dementia, mental illness, or unpredictable behavior, and used them to test unauthorized meds. No oversight, no follow-up. And when funding dried up, they disappeared. Mike hung up and looked down at Storm, who was now sitting beside the torn-up wall of room 309. His ears twitched. His body was tense alert again. You smell some... Mike asked. Storm didn't bark. He just moved forward, nose low, tracing the perimeter of the room. Then he stopped at the far corner, right beside an old radiator, half sunken into the floor. Storm scratched lightly at the floorboards. Mike pulled out his pocket knife and pried up a loose panel. There, wrapped in plastic and tucked beneath the boards, was a leather-bound notebook, old, frayed, stained by time. He opened it carefully. Most of the pages were blank, but near the middle in shaky cursive were scattered entries. Day 14, they told me the trial would be short. Just 60 days. I haven't seen the sun in weeks. Day 33, the walls are closing in, literally. They say I'm unstable. I say they're murderers. Day 47, I hear a dog barking sometimes, but I think it's only in my head. Day 100 plus. They gave me a shot today. I woke up in darkness. No one comes anymore. No more food, no light, only sleep. Mike swallowed hard. Jesus! He flipped to the last page. There was a single name scrawled in large, trembling letters. Kinney. The notebook changed everything. Mike delivered it to the investigators, who opened a formal case against Pharmaco West and began tracing every name tied to the abandoned memory study program. Kinney, who had since relocated to Arizona under a different business name, was now being pursued for questioning by state authorities. As the story hit local news, elderly woman found alive behind wall after 17 years, Storm became an unlikely celebrity. The canine who wouldn't stop barking had become a symbol of vigilance and compassion. People sent cards, treats, even a custom-stitched patch for his harness, Storm the Truth Seeker. But Mike knew this wasn't over. He returned to the hospital later that week to visit Grace. She was sitting up now, eyes clearer, though still fragile. A nurse was brushing her hair when Mike entered the room with Storm. Her face lit up. Storm, she said quietly. Mike smiled. You remember his name? Hard to forget a dog who saves your life, she whispered. He sat down beside her. We found your journal. Her expression faltered. They kept it under the floor. I think they were hoping no one would ever read it. Grace nodded slowly, staring at the window. They said I was dangerous, she said, because I wouldn't cooperate, because I asked questions. I used to be a nurse, you know. I saw what they were doing. The others were too afraid to speak. And they locked you away. She turned her gaze towards Storm. But he heard me, all these years later. He heard me. Mike walked out of the hospital that evening with a weight in his chest, not guilt, not sadness, resolve, because Grace wasn't the only one. If one woman had been hidden, how many others had vanished in similar ways? And what if Storm had never barked at that wall? Back home, Mike took Storm for a walk down Main Street. Locals waved at them. One kid even shouted, "That's the hero dog." Mike chuckled and rubbed Storm's neck. You're not just a hero, buddy, he said softly. You're a damn miracle. As they passed a shop window, Mike caught his own reflection. His uniform, his partner, and something else. The knowledge that even in a world full of noise, sometimes all it takes is one bark in the right direction to change everything. Storm wouldn't stop pacing. It had been 2 nights since Mike handed Grace's notebook over to the state investigators, and ever since Storm had been on edge, restless alert, patrolling the apartment like he was expecting someone to knock on the door or break through the wall. Mike leaned back in his recliner, rubbing his temples. You miss her, don't you? He said quietly. Storm stopped at the window, peering through the blinds at the quiet street outside. His ears twitched. His nose lifted like he was tasting the air for something no human could sense. There was something unfinished in him. Mike felt it too. Because Grace was safe. But this story wasn't. 3 days after the notebook discovery, Mike was invited to a closed-door meeting with two investigators from the Oregon Attorney General's office and a forensic auditor brought in from Sacramento. They weren't calling it a criminal investigation yet, not officially, but they were walking a tight line around something big. Kinney, the man Grace had written about, was proving hard to pin down. He'd sold his ownership stake in Pharmaco West years ago before lawsuits started to surface. He'd gone quiet, legally protected, behind layers of shell companies and overseas accounts. And yet, there's a paper trail leading right to Maple Oaks, one of the agents told Mike. He approved the last renovation before Room 309 vanished from all internal maps. So he knew, Mike said, knew, ordered, possibly designed it. And what about Grace? Why was she still there after all those years? That's when the forensic auditor pulled out a stack of documents, handwritten memos, scans of old invoices, a printed email chain dated 2007. Mike skimmed through them. One memo stood out. Patient 3D9227 has exceeded observation window. Do not reassign. She is no longer compliant. Prepare long-term suppression protocol. It wasn't medical. It wasn't clinical. It was tactical, like she was a problem that needed to disappear. Later that evening, Mike drove back to Maple Oaks, not as a cop, not even as a handler, but as someone who knew there were still ghosts left in that building. Storm sat in the passenger seat, his gaze locked on the facility as they pulled into the lot. The crime scene tape around room 309 had been taken down, but the air still felt heavy. Inside, the halls were quieter than usual. A few residents shuffled by in slippers and robes, whispering as Mike passed. A nurse offered a weak smile and said, "You're the one who found her, right?" He nodded. "God bless that dog," she said. "We had no idea." Mike didn't say what he was thinking. You had no idea, or you chose not to know. He headed straight for the maintenance wing, an area he hadn't explored before. It was tucked behind the laundry room, down a narrow hallway that smelled like bleach and dust. A man in coveralls sat on a stool by the boiler, reading an old issue of Popular Mechanics. He looked up. "You looking for something?" he asked. "Name's Mike Daniels. I'm the one who found room 309. The man's face tightened. "Yeah, I figured you'd come around. You were working here when that wall was built." The man name tag read. Dennis nodded once. "I was told to seal it," Dennis said. "Didn't ask questions." "By who?" "Back then it was Mr. Kinney's people. They said it was for insulation, reducing noise complaints from the psych cases. That's what they called it. Told me not to worry about permits." Mike studied him. "You knew there was someone inside." Dennis rubbed his face, suddenly looking older. "I heard things. Scratching, crying. I told the supervisor. He said it was just air vents. Or rats, but I knew better. Hell, I almost tore it open myself once." "Why didn't you?" Dennis looked up at him, guilt written across every line of his face. "Because I didn't want to lose my job." Mike didn't judge him, not out loud, but in his chest there was a pressure building, grief mixed with fury. How many people had chosen silence over truth, and how many more Graces had been buried in drywall and forgotten? He walked out of the maintenance wing in silence, Storm trotting beside him, steps light but tense. Then Storm stopped, at a different wall, opposite the back cafeteria. He stared, then barked. Mike froze. "No," he said out loud. "It can't be." But Storm wouldn't move. His ears perked up. His front paws scratched at the trim. Same behavior, same intensity. Mike looked around. No residents nearby. No staff in sight. He pressed his ear against the wall. Nothing. Then, a sound. Not knocking this time. A hum. Barely audible. Like an electric buzz or a mechanical rhythm. He grabbed his flashlight and examined the molding. And there it was, in a seam where there shouldn't be one. A poorly patched crack running down the corner joint. Storm barked once more, then sat eyes still locked on the wall. Mike returned the next morning with a warrant. He brought 2 detectives and a structural engineer from the county. "I need to open this wall," Mike said, pointing. Again, one detective asked, "You think there's another room?" "I think there's another secret." Storm stood beside him, silent now but poised, ready. The engineer brought out a scanner and confirmed it a gap. Not large, not human-sized, but something was back there. They opened it carefully this time. No sledgehammer, just precise cuts through old plaster and paneling. And behind it, a chamber. No doors, no vents, no light, just boxes. Inside were dozens of manila folders, sealed baggies, and cassette tapes, all carefully labeled, all bearing Pharmaco West's old letterhead. They'd found the archive, patient records, dosage charts, experiment logs, names, photos, dates. Some files had red X's over them. Others were tagged with status updates like inactive or terminated. Grace's number 309207 was listed in multiple places. One entry read, "Subject non-compliant after week 8. Response unstable. Transferred to manual isolation per Kinney directive." Another, "Observation phase terminated. Retain physical subject for long-term silence protocol." Mike couldn't breathe. This wasn't medicine. This was containment. That evening, he sat in his truck again, with Storm staring at the nursing home under a darkening sky. "I don't think she was the only one," he said quietly. Storm didn't move, but Mike could feel his presence, steady grounding, watching. What if there were more trials, other facilities? What if Kinney did this somewhere else? He looked at the file in his lap, Grace's full record. And at the bottom of the last page, Phase 3, Site Expansion Proposed Locations, Idaho, Utah, West Texas. He turned on the radio, static, then a song, some classic country tune humming about forgotten roads and buried sins. The kind of song you don't really listen to until the words hit you in the right moment. Sometimes the truth don't knock, it scratches at your door. Mike reached over and placed a hand on Storm's shoulder. "You ready for one more?" Storm finally turned toward him, wagged his tail once, and gave a soft, low bark. That was a yes, because Storm didn't chase ghosts. He chased what the world tried to forget. Mike had driven through 4 states in 3 days. Oregon to Nevada, Nevada to Utah, then finally Arizona. Storm sprawled across the backseat of the truck, lifted his head every few hours to watch the desert roll by his eyes, sharp but quiet, like he knew where they were going, even if Mike didn't. The folder lay on the passenger seat, its edges worn from handling. Inside were photocopies of patient records, faded notes, and one name circled in red ink again and again: Edward Kinney. Grace's final journal entry didn't name anyone else, just him. Over and over. Mike had stared at that page too many times. After the discovery of the hidden archive behind the cafeteria wall, state investigators had been granted broader access to sealed records from the now-defunct Pharmaco West. It didn't take long for one name to appear at the top of every questionable transaction. Kinney had dodged accountability for nearly 2 decades. He didn't show up in lawsuits, never faced criminal charges, never spoke to the press, because Kinney knew how to vanish without disappearing. But that was before Storm scratched open a wall. According to the latest intel, Kinney was living under a new identity, David Ellison, in a private retirement community outside Scottsdale, Arizona. Gated, expensive, quiet. A good place for ghosts to hide in plain sight. Mike wasn't sent by the state, not officially. The paperwork was still grinding through bureaucratic mud. But he wasn't about to wait for a green light while the man responsible for burying people alive watered his desert lawn. He wasn't going down there to arrest him. He just wanted Kinney to look into Storm's eyes and remember. The sun was just starting to sink when Mike pulled into the Whispering Palms Senior Villas. The whole place looked like it had been designed to erase guilt. Stucco villas in beige and coral tones, palm trees rustling, golf carts humming, fake smiles everywhere. Mike parked outside Villa 6B. He didn't ring the doorbell, he just knocked 3 times. A moment later, the door creaked open. The man who answered was in his 80s. Thin, bald, tan skin, too tan for someone who claimed to be homebound. But the eyes, they were cold, surgical. Mike didn't say his name, just stepped back and motioned towards Storm. Storm walked up to the doorway and sat right in front of Kinney and stared. Kinney stiffened, just for a second, but Mike saw it. "You remember him?" Mike asked quietly. Kinney blinked. "You've made a mistake." "No, you changed your name. That's not a mistake. That's intent." "I'm not who you think I am." Mike stepped forward, lowered his voice. "Grace Abbott, patient 3-9207. You locked her in a wall." Kinney didn't move. His expression didn't change. But something in his jaw tightened. "She's alive," Mike said. "She survived." That got a reaction. Just a twitch of the mouth. Mike stepped even closer. "She remembers you." Kinney's voice was calm when it came, almost gentle. "She wasn't supposed to survive." The words hit harder than a punch. Mike felt his hands ball into fists. Storm growled softly, his body tense. "What the hell does that mean?" Mike snapped. Kinney shrugged. "We were told to test the limits of isolation therapy, memory detachment, neural repatterning. Grace was the final phase. She was a person. She was an anomaly. Resistant, non-responsive to sedation, uncooperative. We were ordered to remove her from the study. So you buried her." Kinney didn't answer. Mike took a deep breath. He wasn't here to throw punches. But it was getting harder by the second. "You know what we found behind that wall?" he asked. "Your conscience." "No, your legacy." Mike tossed a small object at Kinney's feet. A metal tag, 309-207. Kinney stared at it. Mike continued. The state of Oregon is preparing charges. Civil suits are coming. Grace's story is national now. Your name's going to be back on every headline. I have lawyers. You're going to need them. Kinney nodded slowly, then stepped back and started to close the door. Before he could, Storm stepped forward and barked one sharp, earth-shaking bark. Kinney froze. The door hung half open. He didn't look down. He just said dogs never forget. Then he shut the door. Mike stood there for a moment. Storm let out a low whine. He didn't even flinch, Mike muttered. No apology, no regret. But as they walked away, he noticed something strange. A man in a golf cart watching from across the road. He waved. Mike waved back politely. But something felt off. The man wasn't a resident. His posture was too upright, too alert. Back at the motel that night, Mike stared at the ceiling fan running the encounter over and over in his head. Why didn't Kinney deny it? Why admit she wasn't supposed to survive? Because he thought he was untouchable. Or because he wasn't afraid. Storm curled up at the foot of the bed, still as a statue. Then came the knock. Mike jumped to his feet. He opened the door slowly. A man in a baseball cap stood in the hallway. Mike Daniels. Mike nodded. I'm Agent Cole, Department of Justice. We need to talk. They sat down at the tiny table beside the motel microwave. Agent Cole placed a folder on the table. You're not the only one who's been digging. Mike raised an eyebrow. Cole opened the folder. Inside were photos of other facilities similar to Maple Oaks across the Midwest and Southwest, all once affiliated with Pharmaco West or its partner firms. We've identified 6, Cole said, all with unexplained patient disappearances, gaps in inspection logs, falsified medical records. And Kinney. Not just Kinney, Cole said. There's a network, investors, consultants, medical boards that look the other way. We're talking about a conspiracy that spans over 20 years. Mike exhaled. Grace was the key that unlocked it, Cole said. And your dog? He kicked the damn door in. The next morning, Mike stood outside the hospital again. He had something to tell Grace. Inside, she sat by the window in a recliner wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Her hands were steadier now, her face more present. Mike sat beside her. Storm curled up at her feet. They know, he said. The feds. They're investigating. You're not alone in this anymore. Grace nodded. Her voice was quiet. I kept wondering if I'd made it all up, if it was just in my head. You didn't. I tried to scream, she said, for years. But the walls, they swallowed everything. Mike looked at her. But he heard you. She smiled faintly and reached down to pet Storm. Not all heroes wear badges, she said. Some just bark at walls. The story hit national news that week. Woman found alive behind wall hidden for 17 years in abandoned medical experiment. Public outcry followed. Congressional hearings were called. Kinney was subpoenaed. Investors panicked. But for Mike and Storm, the world didn't change overnight. They still went on walks, still stopped at the coffee shop where Storm got a free pup cup, still made time every Thursday to visit Grace. Because justice wasn't just about headlines. It was about showing up again and again when others look away. One evening as the sun set behind the hospital, Grace looked out the window and said something Mike didn't expect. There are others. Mike leaned in. Others? Grace nodded. I heard them. Before the wall went quiet, whispering, crying, scratching. Maybe it was my mind, maybe not. Mike looked at Storm, who was already sitting up alert again. He didn't speak, because they both knew what came next. The story wasn't over. Not until the last voice behind the wall was heard. The tip came in through an anonymous voicemail. A woman's voice, raspy and distant, left a message on the county hotline. There's another place, out near Lake Elsinore. They called it a recovery center, but people went in and didn't come out. Look for the name Silver Pines. Look for room 207. No name, no number. Just that, and then the line went dead. Mike listened to it twice before playing it for Grace. She was sitting upright now, stronger every day. She still didn't like the overhead lights in the hospital room, too sterile, too bright. But her memory had sharpened. She remembered details, faces, layouts, procedures. When she heard the message, her hands started shaking. I've heard of that place, she whispered. One of the trial sites they never talked about. They transferred people there if they resisted conditioning. I think they called it deep phase therapy. Mike looked at her. Do you think anyone might still be there? I don't think, she said. I know. The authorities were cautious this time. The investigation into Pharmaco West had evolved into a full-scale federal probe. 6 different facilities across 4 states had been identified as experimental containment centers, with Silver Pines listed among them. But due to property changes, defunct LLC ownership, and miles of bureaucratic red tape, no one had yet entered the building. Until now. Mike wasn't law enforcement anymore, but he'd been invited to observe unofficially thanks to the DOJ's appreciation for the case he cracked wide open with Storm. When he arrived at Silver Pines, the sun was just starting to rise. Storm jumped down from the truck, nose twitching, as soon as his paws hit the ground. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, peeling paint, overgrown weeds, broken security lights. A sign near the gate still read, "Private Facility, No Admittance." Mike stood with Agent Cole and two other federal agents in tactical gear. "You sure you want to walk this one with us?" Cole asked. "I walked the last one," Mike said, motioning to Storm, and he ran it. The front lobby of Silver Pines was a ghost of a promise. The receptionist desk had been stripped, the furniture gone, wallpaper curling at the edges like dead leaves. But the power still worked, and the elevator, old wheezing, still hummed. Mike and Storm followed the agents down 2 flights of stairs into the basement. The air turned colder, metallic, and Storm began to growl. Low, steady, focused. He walked straight past the first hallway and stopped at a door marked 207, the exact number from the voicemail. Agent Cole signaled his team. They opened the door, carefully, flashlights on, weapons drawn. It led into a narrow corridor, a tunnel really lined with faded blue tiles and exposed wiring. At the end, another door, this one heavy, reinforced, locked with an old keypad. Storm barked once, then stared. Mike stepped forward. "Do it." They breached the door, and what they found made even the agents go silent. Inside room 207 were 4 beds, 2 of them still occupied. 2 elderly men restrained by cloth ties, eyes wide and sunken, blinked in the sudden light. The smell of antiseptic and mold hung thick in the air. They were alive, barely. Beside them were trays of untouched food, plastic bags of IV fluid, and a wall of paper files logged by hand. Names, dates, dosages. And just like before, most of the files had red slashes. Except 2. The agents quickly called for medical evac. Mike moved slowly toward one of the patients, a man in his 70s, who stared up at the ceiling, his lips moving without sound. Mike knelt beside him. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe now." The man turned his eyes toward Storm. Then with a hoarse voice whispered, "Is it finally morning?" In the following weeks, Silver Pines made national headlines. The discovery of live test subjects in an abandoned memory care center shocked the country. Lawsuits poured in. Politicians scrambled to distance themselves from past campaign donors tied to Pharmaco West and its affiliates. But none of it surprised Mike, and none of it surprised Grace. "I told them," she said when she watched the breaking news from her hospital bed. "I told them there were others." Storm lay at her feet, tail thumping. She looked at him and smiled. He knew it before any of us did. Mike was offered a push with a new federal task force, oversight for elder care fraud, investigative outreach for long-term care violations. He turned it down, not because he didn't care, but because he already had a mission. He and Storm began traveling to facilities across the country, sometimes invited, sometimes not. Storm would walk the halls, sniff the baseboards, watch the walls. Sometimes he barked, sometimes he didn't. But wherever they went, people listened now. And that was the difference. One afternoon in spring, Mike brought Storm back to Maple Oaks. The facility had new ownership, new staff, new rules. Grace had been moved to a care home nearby where she received full-time support and daily visits from a nurse who, unlike the old ones, actually cared. Mike walked through the halls with Storm passing familiar rooms. Room 214, the cafeteria, the corridor that used to be blank but now had a window and sunlight. When they passed the old site of room 309, Storm stopped, then lay down, silent, calm, as if to say, "We did what we came to do." That evening, Mike sat on the porch of the care home with Grace sipping iced tea. Birds chirped. A breeze rolled through the pines. Grace looked at him. "You think they'll ever be punished, the people behind it all?" Mike shrugged. "Some will, others won't, but now the world knows." Grace nodded, her voice soft. "And knowing is where healing begins." Storm barked once, almost like agreement. She reached down and scratched behind his ears. He never gave up. "No," Mike said, "he never does." Storm passed away 2 years later, peacefully, at home, surrounded by people who loved him. He was buried beneath a tree behind Mike's cabin with a simple plaque that read, "Storm, he heard the voices no one else did." Mike visits the grave often, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with questions, and always with gratitude, because it was never about being a hero. It was about not turning away. Today, Mike runs a small nonprofit called Voices Unheard, dedicated to investigating neglect, abuse, and hidden crimes in long-term care facilities across the U.S. The first thing you see on their homepage, a photo of Storm. Beside it, a quote, "Justice starts with listening to the ones who can't speak." Thank you for following this journey. Storm's story isn't just about one dog or one woman. It's about how easily we forget the most vulnerable and how important it is to pay attention when someone or something refuses to stay silent. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe dogs can sense evil? Or maybe even the truth? Let us know in the comments, and if this story moved you, please share it. You never know who might need to hear it.